You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Arsenal Pass, episode 126. Your host, Hayden Dale here, Brennan Patrick. Brennan, how are you?
Good. How have you been, Hayden? You sound delightful right now, actually.
Frog in my throat, as they say. A little bit sick. I feel like role reversal.
Yeah, I feel like they don't refer to it as a frog. It was a mushroom. No, okay, I forgot.
Yeah, been a little bit unwell the last couple of days, unfortunately. Maybe it's coincided with not playing Flesh and Blood. Who knows? But yeah, no. It's all things okay. Otherwise, episode 126. As I said, Brennan, this week we're doing a bit of a fundamentals pod. We're going to be looking at, the reasons you aren't winning events. That's the title of the pod. That's a little bit, on the nose maybe, but I think this is an interesting topic. It's something that I think comes from our learnings over the last few events, over the last couple of years, and I think the things we're going to talk about really extends from, be it Armory level, Pro Quest level, Battle Hardens, Callings, even Pro Tours, and we're going to look into the things in this pod that we think can apply at any level, and the reasons why people, yourself included, ourselves included, might not be converting to win events. What are the reasons separating some of the highest level players, our national champions, our Pro Tour champions, and the rest of the pack?
Rest of the wolf pack, yeah. I just like to extrapolate my philosophy in life, which is it's everyone else's fault. No, but in terms of let's jump into weeks in Flesh and Blood. So you're definitely taking a break from Fab, obviously off the off of Australian Nationals. I recorded a deck tech with Peter today, so Canada deck tech going up soon. Peter did an amazing set of pieces for us to put up on Patreon, both a very detailed guide, sideboard guide, tips and tricks, all that kind of stuff, but also went through all of the math on a spreadsheet for like all the different Kano combo lines you can do, even the unusual ones, right? So when you're using Aether Flare in between Aether Wildfire, when you don't have Wildfire, et cetera, actually makes it super easy because you can find other heuristic-based numbers, by the way, Hayden, that you can reference in the future. Actually, it's really just useful for Kanoker because Kanoker you can call like a 40 or a 38. It's great. But no, Peter went above and beyond. Great player. And so that Kano deck will be coming out very soon. In terms of my week in Flesh and Blood, also taking a break. I've been playing, I was talking to Hayden about this earlier, been playing Lorcana Constructed. So when I first played Lorcana, it was like, it was kind of like underpowered vanilla garbage. Not going to lie. This is coming from someone who's invested in content creation for the game. But playing Constructed has actually been really fun. They have this like community client called Pixelborn, and it is ridiculous. Like it's very, very good. Like it feels like you're playing like a Runeterra client. Obviously a bit bootstrap at that, but unbelievably good. Leaderboards, MMR, matchmaking, everything. Anyway, Constructed is actually pretty fun. I don't know. It's like vanilla tutus, and then they have, like Wheel of Fortune, Joe to Brutality-esque cards, like JM Daytime, like all these like crazy powerful cards. So the decks are actually somewhat mid to high powered, and it's pretty fun. So I don't know. I just want to bring that up because I was surprised that I was actually enjoying the game. I thought it would be similar to what we experienced, a couple months ago, Hayden, when we were both playing with our decks we took from the spoilers. Like,
oh yeah,
whew, this game is ass.
I think I played 4 games and just threw the proxies back at Sasha and said, all right, let's go to dinner. Actually, I think I said, let's play more of your game, to be honest, is I think what I said to Sasha. But yeah. I mean, my week in Flesh and Blood, like you say, taking a bit of a break this week. I also filmed a deck tech for the Droma deck that a few of us took to Nationals, top 8s and top 4s. So you can check that out on the Arsenal Pass YouTube channel. There's also a full sideboard guide and matchup guide on the Patreon. It's funny, I was talking to Brendan before the pod as well. They did an ELO update post, the week 1 of Nationals, and I was saying to Brendan, I went top 4 of my Nationals. I lost 15 ELO, Brendan.
11-3.
We were talking about the Elo system a little bit, and ultimately, like it doesn't matter, right? It's just it's interesting to see, and it comes in different, I think, formats as well. So I think I went slightly positive in CC, and lost quite a lot in limited for the 4-turn limited, but I was super high on the limited leaderboard. So that was I really wanted to hit that. I was hoping I could maybe like pull out like a 6-0 draft and then top that limited leaderboard, take out Yuha, who's been sitting at the top of that limited leaderboard, but he'll have to wait to Worlds now, I think.
I have a funny anecdotal story around the Elo leaderboard leaderboard. So back at Pro Tour 1, when the ratings were even more wild, I went 4-3, so technically positive, and I lost hundreds. It was crazy. But, that just frees you up. It takes off the mental load. And now you can finally go play your Road to Nationals and your Pro Quest that you couldn't before.
With Kano.
Yes, with Kano.
the shackles are off. Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're going to see the elo system as we get more events and obviously more elo into the wild, so to speak. Obviously that'll flesh out and it'll be the system that obviously there's invitations based around it, of course, for Pro Tours and Worlds and stuff as well. So it is important to a lot of people for qualifications that way. Ultimately, I think where it is right now, it's like a nice to be like, yeah, like I've topped this, or I'm in the top 10 or whatever it is, and that's a really nice, I think, kind of reward to see your name up there. And obviously with those invitation based ratings as well. But I think it's kind of there's a long way for the elo system to go. And the K value, depending on like a Pro Tour versus like a Pro Quest, for instance, I do wonder if they will add more ratings based events or kind of tweak the K values a little bit, but we'll see.
I wish honestly I wish it was more prestigious to be higher elo in Flesh and Blood. They do have the leaderboard system and the ratings. You can see your name on the website. But it'd be cooler if they had like a, additional things for people in the top 10, top 50, top 100, maybe things to do at the events, ways to be recognized. Because right now, maybe I could be in a little echo chamber or bubble, but it doesn't seem like it matters very much. It's just kind of like you get your invite and like that's really what you're shooting for. It would be cool if they sort of doubled down and made it a bit more prestigious, and I think invested into that leaderboard and ranking system a bit more.
I think, one thing for me is that an elo system probably isn't a perfect system for those kind of things, really. And I wonder if that's why the kind of investment hasn't been there, because, elo for something like chess can make a lot of sense. And guys, sorry, bear with me through this pod with my voice. Sorry. I will do my best to get through this. But I think, with this, a game like chess, obviously, versus a game like Flesh and Blood that does have those variance elements, maybe elo isn't the perfect system, but that's kind of by the by. People can discuss that all they want. But one of the things I would actually really like to see is something that Magic used to do, which is like the kind of the pro player points, basically the kind of, you compete at your high level events, be it your national championships, your Pro Tours, your callings, for instance, and you get points for the season or for the year based on your finishes. Obviously more points the higher you finish. And I think that you can reward people off the back of that, with putting people into potentially like pro players clubs where next year they get small appearance fees to encourage them to go to even more events. You can also definitely, reward the player of the year, for instance, which isn't necessarily going to be the player who won a PT or won a Worlds. It could just be like, well, they topped 2 big events, or they've like finished in the top 16 consistently. Like, I think it's a really cool way to see like who are the most consistent players, who are the players out there kind of, nose to the grindstone, putting in these results. And a system like that, I would actually be pretty in favor of seeing, but it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work.
For sure. I actually, kind of piggybacking off that, I don't want to get too much on a tangent, but I feel like in Flesh and Blood, we don't really invest into our pro players, at least from the publisher level. Like, we don't really try to build their narratives and build their stories. It sort of happens ad hoc at events, with an interview or, this team is bringing this, but
through content creators.
Yeah, exactly. It's through content creators. I think that, LSS could help 10x, like 100x sort of what it means to be a professional player in Flesh and Blood and help to build that community aspect. Because, that word just doesn't really mean anything to me in Flesh and Blood at the moment. And when I think back to a game like Magic, they made that feel prestigious, right? That was something that you achieved. Where here it's just like, are you not? It doesn't really matter, to be honest. So yeah, I hope that we invest into that in the future, because that's one of the most powerful thing about, I don't know if you'd call it games or whatever, maybe life, but the storytelling aspect that we can sort of put behind these players to help weave the narratives. And, I think you would sort of percolate through the community and generate a lot more excitement as we lead up to these events. Because right now it's just like, you hear about us talk about how the Wolfpack is a caravan of 300 players. But other than that, you don't hear much about them.
No, I agree. I think there's like the narrative side is something something like a pro players club or akin to that from Magic. And if you're not familiar with Magic and how they used to run this, then it's perfectly fine. It's something they used to do back in the day, but it was a really cool thing. It really helped you resonate, I think, even to the point they did things like, pro player cards, for instance, first of all, I think they came in boosters for a little bit. That might be a bit much, but then they started to, like distribute them in events, and players got them to give out to their, to the players and things like that, giveaways and things like that. And I mean, even SCG did that for the SCG tour, right? And even those became household names, people on the SCG tour, for instance. So, like it's an interesting concept, just something that I think I would love to see for that kind of, I mean, look, there's so many aspects of like wrestling, for instance, in Flesh and Blood because of James's kind of affinity with wrestling, and that's a sport that is all about the personalities, the people, and the storylines. So I think there's some ways to create it. Anyway, you said tangent, we definitely tangented, and we often do tangent on this pod, so that's fine. But those are our weeks in Flesh and Blood. Let's pop into the news. Brendan, just want to say, first of all, a massive congratulations to all the Nationals winners this weekend. Probably the biggest of which, or the biggest event over the weekend, was the UK Nationals, which was fully streamed. Going to lead us into, I guess, we weren't going to just talk about this, but I guess we've seen, people ask us this question. So, Brendan, I guess anything to say on the kind of discourse on Twitter over the week about triggers, pummels, the rules, and people's interpretation of such, and honestly, just people being not very nice in the community.
Yeah, I think people would be surprised by my stance on this because, I don't know, it's somewhat neutral. For me, my issue with this situation sort of recurs and happens again and again just throughout the history. And,
maybe first of all, just first of all, like what, I guess we don't have to talk specifically about the players in the event, but this has come about by a discussion around mandatory triggers and the ability to miss beneficial triggers as a player, and or missing your opponent's beneficial triggers and not reminding them of their beneficial triggers, or not carrying out the responsibility, I guess, of what the end result of a mandatory trigger would be for your opponent. Sorry, a beneficial trigger would be for your opponent's side of the table. Basically coming about on stream where in a game a player plays a pummel and then seemingly misses the pummel trigger, and the opponent decides not to discard. That's basically what happens.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I don't like about it, and I haven't liked it about it since the beginning, is just like I would say there is this gray area, but it is actually a concept of a gray area, right? Where the rules are not defined, and it's like, is this okay? Is this not? And that's my biggest complaint. And I said that to Hayden, and he goes, well, actually, the rules are defined. And that's really kind of where it gets uncomfortable. And I wish that things just kind of weren't that way. But if you look at a tier 3 or a tier 4 event, I would rather go by the rules rather than this sort of gray area where people feel like they, I don't know, that they are giving something to their opponent, or, they are building up some sort of social equity by letting them have that tuner trigger or not, and then they don't get it back and it feels unfair. Like, that whole situation, in my opinion, sucks on both sides of the table. Being someone that has, I mean, God, I hesitate to say this because it just feels disgusting, but someone who has given someone a tuner trigger that maybe missed it, like, I don't like being in that situation whatsoever. And I don't think that you're a better or worse person for doing it, but it is just the spirit of the game, the context of the game. And I think that if you find that you have an issue with not giving a trigger or not reminding someone, then instead of maybe complaining and, being angry at people on Twitter, set the example yourself, right? Like, you have sort of the agency and the responsibility to do that. And that, I feel like that's kind of the only line to take here. That's the only real line there is to take. I think that the way it was handled on social media by both parties, mind you, was incorrect and sort of unprofessional. And that's why it is so sour. But ultimately, you have to just look to the rules of the event. There was a table judge there. This is just how Flesh and Blood is played. I understand that some people think that that was not the spirit of the game, but yeah, the way to sort of handle that situation is to not go yell and scream, and for other people to sort of, maybe the champion rub it in your face that they got away with it. Like, none of that is where the situation gets sour. And it has been like that since the genesis of Flesh and Blood. People have been having this conversation of, what is angle shooting? What is not? What is against the rules? What is? And then, obviously the extremes of people calling them cheaters, and like, I think that people just need to sort of relax on the emotional end of it, and then, we need to stick to the rules. There is comprehensive rules for a reason, and that is really the guiding light. And I think that if you have a problem with that, and that you think that you wouldn't do that in situation, you telling people that you wouldn't on Twitter is not the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to just set the example and to be that player yourself. And I just don't really think there's much of a conversation past that.
Fair. I mean, I think you say it pretty well. I do. The only distinction I wanted to make in this situation is that for people who might be, sort of saying they might just, potentially not even understand the kind of the rulings that surround this. So first of all, I want to point out that this kind of interaction with missed beneficial triggers is not cheating. I think that's really clear that I want to point that out as a level 1 judge and as a competitive player. When it comes to then the spirit of the game, well, actually, the next thing I want to say is also, I think in the situation from having the table judge there and their clarification of the event, also not angle shooting or sharking as it is by the rules. So it's not against the rules. In terms of the spirit of the game, I mean, that's where this debate comes in, right? And people are free to have the spirit of the game debate. I just would, encourage people to not make it personal and to try and, like Brendan says, keep it community orientated and think about, kind of just enacting this as you play Flesh and Blood and as you want to play Flesh and Blood. And I've been in those situations before, right? Where it's like you just said, I'm going to hold myself to the highest level when it comes to making sure that I play correctly. And you know what? I missed this trigger. I've missed a tunic trigger before. You know what? Damn, missed that tunic trigger there. I really need to make sure I'm not missing this trigger in the future. Leads nicely into our pod today. But, then for my opponent later on to then get halfway through the turn and ask me for the tunic trigger, that puts me in a really difficult position because I feel like I'm holding my opponent to the same standards I'm holding myself to, which is the highest of competitive integrity. I'm speaking at, obviously competitive events here. It's a really tough situation. And, this kind of, I do like the kind of change now about, we can flake to judges, miss triggers, and there is ways to resolve triggers a lot cleaner now with kind of a base on game state where we can potentially rewind the game state to fix or make partial or complete fixes to events that have happened in the game, which is, I think, it has been a good fix overall. I think there was a bit of teething problems for the first few weeks, but it seems like it's been a bit of a better fix overall. But this ongoing debate around, this especially beneficial triggers, especially when the beneficial triggers require the opponent to do something, I think is going to be an ongoing piece of Flesh and Blood that is probably the greyest area. Although, again, within the rules, it's not particularly grey. But yeah, I think Brennan kind of nailed it.
I think that when you perceive something as morally virtuous and then you sort of put that onto your opponent as well and sort of expect them to follow some sort of ephemeral set of rules that you have socially constructed to exist that don't, and then you look at them as a bad person when they don't do that, when they don't give you a tunic trigger, when they maybe get away with a pummel, or whatever. It's like, I think that person is more in the wrong than the other. It's like ultimately at a professional event, you just follow the rules. Like, that's it. And you it might seem like there's a gray area, but there's not. And you don't want there to be, because it leads to bad experiences on both sides of the table. Like, you don't want to be building up this weird sort of social credit that isn't actually exists. And then when you give your opponent something and they give you something, and by the way, it's all subjective too. It's just like, you will feel cheated. They will feel cheated. It just sucks. It's like competitive event. You just go by the rules, and trust me, it's better that way. That is I think, in my opinion, the best way to do it from every angle is to just go follow the comprehensive rules. Because this has been, even before there was comprehensive rules, people were doing this shit and people were complaining about it. You just got competitive event, follow the rules.
It's a tough one as well, because I think, the way the game is played, often these things just naturally happen, so it's like, my opponent plays CNC. I choose, my part of my decision process is, if I don't block here, I lose my arsenal, right? So it's like, okay, I'm not going to block here. And then I'm like, okay, take 6, throw the arsenal in the bin, right? It's all part of kind of the way you just play the game, which is what I understand, and I completely understand why people maybe feel a bit hard done by in that respect, right? Or that's the kind of contention that comes up. Feel the same way in terms of that's how I think the game would naturally play. But again, I think like Brendan says, it's I honestly not really sure what I'll say other than just to point out, I guess, that I think from our side we understand on both sides, and I think just moving forward.
Yeah, I think both,
the
honestly,
way to approach the
both sides
conversation.
of the argument should be, in my opinion, from what I've seen, both sides of the argument here should try to be a bit more community oriented and less toxic. And that's my only take here is I think that both sides were being obnoxious and toxic to an extent. Not everybody, but that was my takeaway.
All right. Well, we can move on. We love the community, Brendan. We want everyone to, enjoy the games of Flesh and Blood and, continue the positivity that we've honestly, this community overall has been mostly entirely positive,
Yes.
which has been like quite an anomaly, to be honest. In gaming communities, but honestly, it's amazing, and I think for the majority of the time, it's amazing to be a part of this community. So I just want to end on a good note there. I have one question for you, which is actually something from you said at the start of the pod, which isn't actually relevant to this at all, but people wanted to know is what the heck is Kanoker and how can we play Kanoker, Brendan?
Honestly, we should probably do a video on it because it is a bit beyond the scope of me sort of explaining it to you in words in the news section. But I will give you the overall concept is a shared deck, a shared Kano deck, where you are dealt 2 cards. Each person is the only unique aspect of the game is that you are dealt 2 cards, and those 2 cards represent the top of the deck. A talismanic lens, in a sense. Other than that, everybody has the same equipment. Everybody has a Ragamuffin's hat, a Tunic on 3, Stormstriders, Metacarpus Node, Crucible, Kano, of course. And then you simply go, you're going to flip 4 cards like you would in a river. You get dealt another card, which is your arsenal. That is also unique. But then you deal 4 cards in a river, and people sort of incrementally bet how much damage they think they can do. Those 4 cards represent the cards in hand, right? So you have the 2 cards that are on the top of the deck. You are dealt an arsenal, and then information is revealed on what cards are in the hand, and you incrementally bet, and basically the person who has bet the most has to display it, and if people tie, they will the deck can be reconstructed totally fine, so they can show it as well, so one person defer to the other. But yeah, if you don't do the amount of damage that you have bet, you lose and everybody else gets your money. And the way that we play it, so it's fun, is we play 5-second turns. So you can't think about it. You got to know the heuristic math, and you have 2 minutes to resolve the combo. Because some people will sit there and they'll say 45, and then they'll waste everybody's time for 10 minutes while I try to figure out a 45 damage combo, which doesn't exist. So 2 minutes as well. And if you violate as well, everybody else gets your money. That's Kanoker. We could go to a more detailed explanation of it. The deck that we used is the deck that will be on the Kano deck.
Oh, that sounds scary for Kanoker.
Yeah, with but not the attack actions. It's just the star tidings are the 60. But there is an Eye of Ophidia, so there is effectively a Joker in the deck. You can hit that at the top and you're out.
Not in a good way. All right. So we had some questions about what the heck is Kanoker. So there you go. But maybe a video to come sometime soon. Maybe we can just do a video of me and you playing some Kanoker.
Probably at Worlds,
might be hard,
right? We'll probably do it at Worlds.
Okay.
Yeah,
we'll get some players together. We'll play Kanoker at Worlds because Brendan will obviously have his Kano deck with him.
What?
All right, moving on the news. Just quickly wrapping up. Battle Hardened Columbus happened this past weekend along with all the nationals. Congratulations to Brody. Again, winning another Battle Hardened on Lexi. Lexi, just from a Living Legend update standpoint, Lexi and Icelander look like neither will Living Legend during this national season. Mm-hmm. But post Bright Lights into the ProQuest season, it looks like both could be in positions to potentially Living Legend out pretty quickly, or in that ProQuest season at least. So it looks like for the kind of start of that Bright Lights season, we will have a pretty similar middle with Bright Lights. Obviously, sans Briar, who's already hit Living Legend. But then as we move on, towards Worlds, we could very well see a season that includes Bright Lights, of course, but now without Icelander and Lexi. They're both hovering. It looks like they're going to finish both around the kind of like 800 to 920 mark on LL points. Yeah,
it was just funny because I will maintain my point of view that I think that the most impactful change to Flesh and Blood Classic Constructed has come through the Living Legend system, despite it being a somewhat ad hoc and imperfect system. Living Legend is what actually sort of leads to real change in the game and interesting disruption, right? Because if Lexi and Icelander go out, somewhat simultaneously, the game will change drastically.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I fully agree. We've seen the biggest impacts from Living Legend. I think that is very, very true. Roundtable, we talked about this last week on the pod. It kind of dropped just as we were doing the pod last week. This is releasing Friday, September 29th. If you haven't seen this already, this is the collaboration with the professor from Tellurian
Community College. Did you almost say Tellurian Dropouts, like old Rob Sogel?
No. I almost say Academy, like Tellurian Academy, right? Because of the card, but being a Magic player. But so I'm always like careful of that. But yes, I mean, I've taken a more in-depth look, I would say, at the cards. I'm actually excited for this product from almost purely a casual standpoint and a way to potentially bring some of my friends who have like kind of been umming and ahhing about Flesh and Blood from a casual standpoint to play the game, who aren't particularly competitive players but are interested in trying the game. I think this is going to be a product that I'm going to pick up and bring to them. We talked about this last week, the dual decks, what wasn't it? The versus wasn't it?
Classic battles, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. Yeah.
How well that sticks in my mind. It's the brain fog right now.
I would say repress the memory, to be honest.
So no, I've had a look. Obviously there are some cards for Class Constructed, I think, in here. There's some cards for Blitz, definitely. I also think that my running theory still is that the Mechanologist cards are going to be in Bright Lights. And also some of these cards also in Bright Lights and other facets as well, potentially. So that's my theory, at least, anyway. We'll see. That
would definitely be a good guy move by LSS. That would be respecting their player base, in my opinion. If they do that, that would be very nice. Because the introductory casual kitchen table product serves its audience, but the competitive player base so if those cards are not reprinted, it will likely hurt both player bases because it will increase the demand to where the supply cannot fulfill it, or it will increase the price as a result of increasing the demand and the supply staying fixed, which is bad for all parties. So hopefully you're correct.
Economics with Brendan Patrick on the Arsenal Pass podcast. So yeah, I'm excited for this product, actually. Yeah, looking forward to it. So Friday, September 29th.
Can't wait for our product to come out, right?
Yeah, that's coming. It's surely. All right, one more week of Nationals. Bright Lights just around the corner. I reckon we get a juicy preview, Brendan. I hope so.
Nah, maybe you. So if they did two again, I'll get the turd and you get the golden nugget.
What was yours again? Chains of...
You don't even know what card... Like, that's the thing, is the card doesn't even exist. Chains of Mephitis.
It exists. All right, let's move on. Commander Cookout time, Brendan. We've got a question from a calling champion on the pod this week. Submitted to our Discord from Road2. We asked for some questions the other week, and I think it's a great question. And this kind of ties in a little bit with what we've seen with Round the Table, sorry. How would you try to improve the onboarding process for new players? Do you think there's a place for an official budget constructed format? Brian Gottlieb and others have cited the experience of new players going winless after a few armories due to Fab being a lower variance game, and this issue is often exacerbated in constructed formats. Jumping straight into Blitz and CC against players with fully powered decks can be disheartening for new players who haven't picked up their first legendaries yet. While we've seen LSS put effort into creating commoner and Blitz precons, these formats are limited in their scope and can lack appeal, replayability for experienced players. Casual formats like UPF and PvE are seeing more support, but they appeal to multiplayer experience that seems separate to 1v1 constructed gameplay. Could LSS implementing something like the Clash format be a possible solution for players to jump into constructed Fab with less financial commitment? I've enjoyed the gameplay of commons plus rares alongside specializations, and I think with a tuned ban list, it would be a more friendly way for new players to play their upgraded precon or deck built from a booster box or two.
Okay, so my first question would be, so if they did come out with this format, if they did support it, would it be a format that was played at callings or battle hardens or, competitive events? And that's a range of events. Because one thing that I'll say, at least from anecdotally from personal experience, is that my locals, they tend to play formats that are going to be featured in upcoming tournaments. So if there is a Class Constructed tournament coming up, they play Class Constructed every week. They don't really do the rotation because Flesh and Blood players tend to get, burnt out of a draft set or something like that after a while because, it can be 3+ months. So they will tend to play formats that are relevant to upcoming tournaments. And I think that if, Flesh and Blood was like, okay, we are going to officially support Clash, it's in your local armory, maybe it had a launch weekend. I just think that if it was never featured again in like a battle hardened tournament or a calling or something, a lot of locals would drop, or a lot of local stores would drop because people wouldn't be interested in really practicing it. Maybe they would play it kitchen table, but ultimately I think the support has to sort of foster and grow at the local game store level for the format to even kind of effectively exist, right? To really exist, because Clash you can play Clash right now. It's just not a real format, right? Would it be good for the game? And would it be a better onboarding? Well, when I talk to people about Flesh and Blood who have never played it, the biggest critique initially is the price of constructed decks. While I think that is, artificially inflated and that a lot of these players wouldn't need specific cards that are driving the price of those decks up in order to compete, especially at the army level, it's a huge barrier of entry because people see the $1,000 decks and they think that is they need to spend $1,000 to engage with the game at level 1, which is absolutely not correct. It's a fallacy, but card game players, whether they are actual competitive players or actual casual players, they trend towards wanting to play the best decks. They want to win. Of course, there are players like to brew and stuff, but oddly, in card games, other than more than other games, people tend to optimize a bit more. So it seems. So Hayden, I'm going to pass over to you because I don't have an answer to the core question. I just have answers to like some of the supporting questions. So I will pass.
So I'm glad. I feel like we've tagged him here because I didn't really have an answer about Clash because to me, like, I have the same problem that you do. Is like players want to like as a gateway, right? Like Rotu specifically asked about onboarding, right? And I don't know if a format that has no clear pathway right now, and not to say it couldn't in the future, but it's not a supported format currently, doesn't have a clear pathway, right? So I kind of agree with you. If this is a format that's just being played at the kitchen table, then that kind of has the same problems as the PvE aspect that is discussed in this question, right? Which is fine. Like that's not the be all and end all, but I'm just not sure that that's going to solve the onboarding issue, especially bringing people into the Blitz and Classic Constructed format and even the limited format. So I have a thought, but first of all, I have a question for you, Brendan, which is what was the easiest format we've had so far to bring someone into the game for?
Sealed.
Sealed?
To bring someone into the game? Yes.
Okay, meta. Maybe let me say meta rather than format. I may have thrown you off with format. Sorry.
Okay. The easiest meta, probably the Phi meta, Uprising.
Interesting. I was going to say Starvo.
Oh, yeah. You win. That's it. That's it. You win.
I think... So there's obviously a lot of people had a lot of problem with Starvo as a hero and with that meta in general. I think Starvo, and I'll go back to this, I've said this so many times, I was, the villain on this pod enough times talking about how much I thought Starvo was good for the game, and I will just say it one more time. That's probably the last time I say it, but I think the ability for people, like new players, to pick up the deck, honestly, the cost barrier for that deck at a very basic level wasn't that bad either. It was literally a bunch of draft commons. Yes, some of the cards, I do agree. There's the cost barrier, something we can talk about in a second. But I think actually cost barrier wise, Starvo was one of the least prohibitive decks. When you look at the kind of spread of legendaries, you could even play that deck without Tunic. But I think that bringing people into the game, it was like very straightforward to understand. You draw your pieces, you put them on the table, you play your big attacks, and you go bonk, right? Like, as much as you want to say, this is nuance to Starvo and playing in the Prism matchup was very difficult, I completely agree. But the base level of what that deck could do and the power level at a very approachable level, I think was good for the game. And I would like to, honestly, I think the fix is to make the ability for decks like this to exist in some way, shape, or form, whether it be in Classic Constructed, whether it be in Blitz. My other piece to add on to that for a financial standpoint would be a card like Hardened Cross Trap. Currently banned in Blitz, I think is the perfect piece of equipment for Blitz. Now, the problem is obviously just the pure power level of that card versus other cards. But I want to see maybe, not to be unbanned, but particularly maybe a card of a similar ilk printed for Blitz that allows players to come into play Blitz at a fairly cost-friendly level, reminiscent, I'm going to go back to Magic here a bit, of playing something in Magic like Mono Red, for instance, right? Where it's like, here you go, here's the deck that just goes, you just play your cards, you just deal them damage to the face, and then the game ends, whether you win or you lose. And I think that is a bit more friendly to the entry level, particularly armory level. So those are kind of things I think this kind of aspect or this essence of what Starvo was particularly good in that range. And then also this ability to maybe from a cost standpoint print some more friendly equipment, which to be fair they have done a little bit, but I think there's more work that could be done there, especially when it comes to the Blitz format in particular. But those are the kind of solutions I have.
Devil's advocate. So I somewhat, partially, a bit agree with you about Starvo, but I will say that I think that Flesh and Blood is a niche game. I think that it has a target audience, and that target audience loves the aspect of Flesh and Blood that makes Flesh and Blood Flesh and Blood. If Flesh and Blood transitioned into a game that was either dominated or had the prevalence of many decks like Starvo existing at the top end of competitive play, I don't know if I would like Flesh and Blood anymore.
Yes, I agree.
So
No, I agree
that
with
that is the paradigm, right?
You've got, and it's a balancing act, right? But also, I would say you don't need a lot of decks like that to exist. You just need one. And I think, I think Starvo could be that to a degree. For instance, what we saw, but also there's ways to potentially balance that a little bit more. That format in particular was really high powered, right? So there's obviously a balancing act to be done there. But yeah, look, I'm not a game designer, don't have all the answers, but I just think from an onboarding standpoint, making it a bit easier for new players to win some games early, find it a bit more approachable, and get into the game. I think there has to be, and something that Brian talked about when he came on the pod a few weeks ago, right? Like increasing the power level of heroes of the variants. Like maybe that's a way to do it, right? Like here you go, here's your deck. Yes, this deck isn't super consistent, but it does some ridiculously powerful stuff. Go forth and you'll just win some games off variants. That is a great, that I won't say it's great, but that's potentially a good way to start out for new players.
Yeah, it's very high risk, high reward from the game design standpoint. I think that they can try to loop in newer players and casual players with that sort of game design. But if they do that, they go forward with that, and they don't sort of catch the casual player base, the new players that they're looking for, but they do introduce that to the game, they do threaten sort of the lifeblood of what is Flesh and Blood. And I think that the players that sort of support the game is propped up by the competitive scene, in my opinion, at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of Flesh and Blood games going on around the world that I don't know about, but it does seem like Flesh and Blood is a very competitive-oriented game. So I think that they have the right philosophy, they're going in the right direction, but I do think it is very risky because it's a balancing act. I mean, when Starvo came out, when it was a thing, I was like, wow, this is really dog shit hero design. Like I thought that it was really bad hero design because you were winning the game in deck building and not in gameplay to an extent. Obviously nuance, mirrors are hard, prism matchup is hard.
Yeah.
But as a competitive player, I definitely did not enjoy that deck at the time.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think the difference, though, like one thing I'll say is I completely agree with you about that kind of, the competitive orientation and where the game currently sits. And I don't think that's necessarily 100% the future for Flesh and Blood. And I think obviously products like Round the Table are showing that in the PvE kind of aspect and multiplayer, etc. But also you need to bring in new competitive players and a lot of who will be competitive players are players who start at the armory level and find, they win a game at their first armory, for instance, and that kind of gets the needle in the arm, for instance. It's like if this potential competitive player comes to 3 armories in a row, 03, 03, 03, what's the likelihood they show up to that 4th? It's diminishing, right? Over each armory. Honestly, it is just going to be. So yeah, I think there's a responsibility to find a balancing act there. There's no right answer. But anyway, great question. Interested to hear anyone's thoughts in the comments. Let us know what you think players could do. What do you think about things like the Clash format? What do you think about things like potentially introducing the power level of, or at least the linearity of a hero like Starvo into the format again? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we just talked about.
I actually think I have an idea for the future success of Flesh and Blood, the lifeblood per se. I think that we could do, $1,000 buy-in tournament sanctioned Kanoker.
There you go. He's nailed it. I'm not very good at Kanoker, to be fair, so I don't know. All right, main topic of the pod time. Brendan, quickly, if you do want to get your questions in for the Commander Cookout, you can do so either emailing us, arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. You can drop them in the YouTube comments below. If you are on the YouTube version of this pod, you can tweet at us, either to the official Arsenal Pass Twitter or to either myself and Brendan, or you can even, if you're on the Arsenal Pass Patreon Discord, you can drop them in the channel there, which is what Rotu did for this question. Anyway, Brendan, main topic time. Why aren't you winning your events? This is the question. Now, this sounds it's a little bit simplified, the title of this pod, why you aren't winning events. But honestly, I think we've got 5 things here that kind of boil down to the difference between people who are consistently winning events and people who, myself included, making top 16s, top 4s, top 8s, be that at your armory level, your ProQuest level, your nationals level, all the way up to your Pro Tour Worlds level. Because all 5 things we're going to talk about, they're all sliding scales, really. They're all kind of things that almost every single player does to a degree. And I think you're going to find yourself somewhere along this kind of spectrum. And it's about just improving, little improvements, I think, to get yourself further along with basically not doing these things so that you can win more events. I honestly just think that's kind of what it boils down to, Brendan.
Mm-hmm. And point number 1 is one that definitely resonates with me, which is you brought the wrong deck, or you didn't bring the right deck. So,
yeah.
What were you going to say?
No, go for it.
Oh, no. Yeah, I think that metagaming, and obviously this is a very much a sliding scale, but metagaming, understanding the meta, like what can show up, what is currently performing, in recent events, and what you can likely extrapolate and project to show up at your event. We're in national season right now, which is interesting because they're competitive events, but they are somewhat demographic based, right? Like there are regions that have high representations of certain heroes rather than others, etc. So you really need to understand, your specific area, or just, sort of blow that out to something like a world championship. Like what are the current conditions going on in the meta that can help predict what decks will show up, recognizing what is the best deck, what is the deck to beat. And all of those questions can really help you optimize your testing as well, right? For instance, in today's meta, if you were brewing up a new deck, you wanted to maybe play Kano or something like that, and your deck couldn't beat Lexi, you should literally just stop there. You can optimize to try to beat Lexi, but if you never get past point 1, don't go to step 2, 3, 4, 5, don't optimize your Jermaine matchup, etc., unless you are willing to take an auto loss to the most, or whatever your loss ratio is, to the best deck in the room, which would probably fall under our description of, maybe you brought the wrong deck to the tournament.
Yeah, and I want to point this out. This isn't a slight saying, you can't play your pet deck or whatever it is, but I think what this really is like picking the best deck for you to succeed. And at times this is going to be the best deck in the meta. At times this is going to be the deck that you are most familiar with. At times this is going to be a deck that is neither of those two things. And also it's going to be dependent on the time and investment you have to potentially learn this hero. But I think one of the things, like time and time again, that I see people make the mistake of is they go, okay, I will play this hero. This is the hero that I want to play, which is fine. And then they don't think about the things Brendan just said in terms of the metagame, or making sure they understand how to beat their best matchup, beat the most prevalent matchup, for instance, or just honestly just being like, okay, I played this deck last time and it's the deck I know, so I'll play it, without kind of bringing in the aspects of this new and current meta. And I think that is kind of the downfall for a lot of people. I think, when it comes to playing the best deck, like this isn't going to be the correct decision for everyone, right? Like there's times where Icelander, for instance, has been the best deck. Would I go out there and say, you should go and play Icelander at your event? Probably not, right? Like if you don't have the time to put the reps in and learn it might not be the best option for you. Instead, the best option for you might be the best aggressive deck in the format that you have some reps on, for instance. It could be Fire in that meta, for instance, even if it's a slight dog to Icelander in that meta. It's like, well, that's fine, but you also still have a pretty good matchup spread with Fire. So it's really contextual. I just think my biggest advice I want to give to players when it comes to deck selection for events, if you're trying to get that one step further and you're trying to make sure that you're consistently able to punch your ticket to the Pro Tour, for instance, or you're able to make day 2 at the calling, for instance, is to be more partial about how you look at selecting a deck. Take a step back and say, okay, what is happening in the meta right now, as Brendan says. What is viable options for me? And if it's one of these is, my pet deck, for instance, do I have the ability to or the hero that I main, do I have the ability to derive the plans that are going to get me success? And let's take a step back. Like let's get some advice from my friends and stuff. Am I just kind of coping a little bit and saying, I've got a 40% matchup into Lexi here? Is it really like a 10% matchup? It's really like you're going to have to get very lucky to win. Or have you actually got a really well fleshed out strategy here that either might catch some people off guard or is actually just can consistently get you some wins? I think that's something important to think about.
Yeah, rationalizing your deck. So sometimes it's just important.
We've all been there, Brendan.
Yeah, it's important to just, you can look at it objectively first, and then you can decide to ignore the objective truth and choose whatever deck you want. But when you lose, you should know that you made a suboptimal choice, which is part of the fun of card games. Sometimes all the fun isn't in winning, believe it or not. But you need to take that objective look at the metagame, at what deck you're potentially going to pick, and the sort of expected matchups that you will face, and you look at that critically. And from there, that should really be the guiding light on your choice. I think that honestly, looking at the metagame is one of the most important things before picking a deck. Some people, they like to auto default to the deck that they have the most reps on or the deck they're most comfortable with, and that could be the right choice. But correctly predicting a metagame will win you so many more games, I think, than having an extra 10, 20, 30 matchups on some decks. Like if you get the metagame correct, you can blow the top off a tournament.
Yeah, with a range of probably hero options, to be honest, because you can tweak and tick, right? Like I think one of my personal, I think, like strengths has been in this game is like we've mostly nailed meta games, I think, when it's come to deciding, and it's helped us a lot with deck selection. Like I think when I went to Worlds, Kano was not the best choice, right? Like, and I took Kano to Worlds, but I think that when I took a step back and tried to evaluate it semi-rationally, to be honest, I locked into Kano pretty early and was like, I'm just going to grind this deck a little bit because I think people are still underprepared. So I definitely rationalized it to a degree. But I think I did take a step back, especially in the last couple of weeks, and was like, okay, I've played enough Icelander here. I could play Icelander. My concern with playing Icelander is that I didn't feel prepared enough for the mirrors, particularly. I didn't particularly want to play mirrors. I didn't enjoy them. So there's the enjoyability factor that Brendan just talked about. And I was worried about people like actually taking for Icelander because I thought it was the best deck in the format. So like, honestly, I kind of decided to not play Icelander for that reason. I honestly, I think it wasn't the right reasoning and it was some rationalizing. Like I've definitely been, fallen afoul of this before, like 4 Worlds, for instance. But, I definitely went through that process, I think. And I just encourage people, if they're looking to make sure that they're bringing the right deck to events, is to be a bit more impartial about their deck selection. And if you want to win more events, like just bringing the right deck is going to get you some percentage, and for a lot of people, significantly higher percentages of wins. There's some decks out there where you don't even necessarily need to grind them out. For instance, like a few games of like dedicated testing to understand the deck list could be more than enough than you need to be for that deck to be a much better pick than what you're already considering.
All right, point number 2 is, and this is the point that gets over applied. People like to default to this point is why they lose, but it's you lost before you sat down. And that could be picking the wrong deck. That could be playing against someone that is, objectively just much, much better than you, getting paired into the wrong person, etc. And getting your one unlosable matchup that represents 0.5% of the metagame. Sometimes that will happen, right? Sometimes that'll happen. Sometimes your draft will get destroyed, and please don't be one of those people that blames other people in their pod for drafts. You are all cringe who do that. Don't do that. But it happens, right? It's a possibility. And I think you need to appreciate that variance aspect of card games. It's part of the reason why you play this card game, is because it is not chess, and that will happen. That being said, I wouldn't attribute too much to this, and there's not much you can do to sort of avoid it, but I think it's important for sort of your mental game and, just playing, kind of continuing your career, as you would say, or your sort of your length of play as a professional player, because when it comes down to it, a lot of it is just numbers. Like it's very unlikely that you will just sort of spike your first event, win, and your first event is going to be sort of the highlight of your career. No, it's likely that you will go through a period of time, maybe not receiving optimal results, but eventually, if you play enough and you keep practicing, you will get your break. There's a concept that when if you sit 2 players down, you put 2 decks in front of each other, the game, if played 100% optimally, is actually predetermined. There is no skill aspect. There's only the deviation of misplays and the lack of skill that sort of derives you away from this already predetermined result. So while that is not going to be the case for actually probably 100% of you, we're at the limit of 99.99%, it is something to consider that sometimes you will just lose. Like, that's why you play Flesh and Blood, actually. That's why you play this game, is because it has, if not a massive amount, a bit of variance.
Yeah, it does. I think that you make some good points there. And the thing is you need a bit of luck, a bit of variance to go your way to win events. Like, people will outperform their quote unquote skill level, right? With a bit of variance, and people will underperform, right? In events, even with correct, deck selection and things like this, right? That is going to happen. I mean, we can look at the highest level, right? Like, Michael Hamilton is, if not the best player in the world, like one of the best players, right? And the wins he's gotten, he's also had to have some variance go his way, or some things go his way in games to get there. Like, it's always going to be the way, and that's going to happen at any level. But I think this kind of idea of you lost before you sat down is honestly like a mental piece. And that is I think this kind of boils down to, like you were saying, Brendan, kind of the mentality of the game. And one of these things, right, is like, I can give an example. Last weekend or 2 weekends ago at Nationals, right? End of day 1. I'm sitting there. I'm at 7 and 2 or whatever it is, looking at the bracket for the 3 rounds I constructed on day 2. Looking at my bracket, and I just looked down the page, and it's like Icelander, Dash, Dromai Mirrors, Icelander, And then I'm like scrolling down, and there's one fire player. I'm like, okay, this is my bad matchup, right? Like, I just need to dodge this matchup tomorrow on round 1, and we're good to go, team. We're good to go, right? Obviously, I pair into the fire round 1, you know? But my mentality in that situation is like, okay, well, I know what I need to do in this game. It is probably, if not my worst matchup, one of my worst matchups. But the mentality is like, I'm still going to win this game. I'm still going to take this game at a time and do everything I can to win this game and not have lost the game before I sat down, which I just think is a mental barrier. And I think this happens with, players, and maybe they sit down across from a big name, for instance, or a player that they really respect, or they have this kind of this voodoo of being not able to beat. Honestly, I think I've played like 6 games of competitive, like sanctioned Flesh and Blood against Matt Rogers. I've won the first game we ever played, which was the calling final, and then I've not beaten this guy since. And I think when I sit down, I'm like mentally like slightly, I've been like, I'm trying to make sure I'm not slightly defeated before I sit down. And I think everyone has those players, right? You have your player that whenever Brendan sits down across from me, he just knows that he's going to lose. But, he tries to shake that mindset.
Oh, actually, that happens to me with Sasha Markovic, actually.
Oh, no.
Because
it's the opposite for him.
I sort of learned card games with him. So there's like, and he's also a really weird person. So when you play with him casually, it's like, he's one person. When you play with him competitively, he's like literally like
different person.
Unrecognizable. But yeah, I just like can't beat him in a lot of like competitive games where there's actually stakes. For instance, we were playing a vintage cube in the UK when we were back there for Marvel Snap. From his friend brought it, and I had lethal on board, and then Sasha made an illegal play and angle shot me for the win. We were in the lobby. Like, I don't even know why. And I didn't recognize it. Yeah, I don't think he recognized it either. But I was just like, I actually woke up at 2 a.m. and I texted him. I was like, you bastard! Like, you actually just cheated me.
You remembered?
Yes.
Yeah. Did he cheat, or was it angle shooting?
No, he cheated.
But no, I just think, all these kind of points is losing before you sit down, like the gym pairings, like feeling your gym paired, your draft goes awry. Like Brendan said, I got cut in pack 2, this person switched, and I feel like my draft just went downhill. Who cares about that? Like, that's out of your control, right? You control every element you can within your control, and that's all you can focus on. And that's how you make sure that you kind of, if not avoid it, because maybe avoiding this is hard. Like we said, even it gets to the, I was going to say the best of us. It gets to us. We're not the best of anyone, but it gets to everyone, right? And I think it's just about mitigating how much you kind of get into this mentality of lose before you sit down as much as possible. Draft went badly, no worries. 3 rounds of draft, just take it game by game.
Mm-hmm. All right, point number 3, you aren't as prepared for your opponent. You aren't as prepared as your opponent for the game you're about to play. I mean, I think that Flesh and Blood is a very high skill. It's very much a skill-based game, and practice definitely does make perfect. And at that, perfect practice makes perfect. So people that have optimized sort of their testing routines have put in, a bit more concentrated effort in preparing for this tournament, preparing for these matchups. You will sometimes sit across from people that are just more prepared for you. They're more ready for the matchup. Maybe they've brought cards that you haven't sort of predicted yet. There's a tech card in their deck. You're playing the best deck. They've brought some sort of card that you haven't anticipated. It blows you out. And that's just, that's a part of the game. Obviously, this is a part of the game that you have massive agency over, right? And a lot of this happens prior to the tournament. Actually, all of it. And you're preparing for tournaments appropriately is actually key to performing in them. I know that sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many people that lose at tournaments and never look back at their testing process, how hard they tried, etc. And yeah, I think in Flesh and Blood, you will reap the rewards of your input to an extent. Like, your output should be sort of reminiscent of the amount of work and effort that you put into it, the players you surrounded with, the decks you picked, etc. And that preparation comes before the tournament.
Yeah. I was laughing because I accidentally made a bit of a typo in the question, and I was just like, listen to Brendan, I was like, I'm Ron Burgundy. Yeah. So very professional Brendan on the fly, getting that done there. Look, no, this kind of not being as prepared as the person sitting down across from you, a lot of the time that is going to mean that they have a significant advantage in the game, even if it is a good matchup for you, for instance, because yes, it's a good matchup for you, but have they come prepared to make sure that they can try and skew that in their favor? Yeah, almost certainly. And if they've done it better than you have, or at least, maybe you haven't done it at all, kind of prepared for what they could do, it can put you in some tough situations. So this kind of idea of preparedness, like, I really subscribe to the philosophy of like, work smarter, not harder, when it comes to preparation for events. Like, I don't play hundreds and thousands of games on the deck I'm going to play. Even for instance, like this past nationals, I honestly think the total number of Dromai games I played was, I think, sub 50. I don't think I played more than 50 Dromai games before my nationals, but I made sure that all the games I played had as much impact as possible. So the games I played were against matchups I really cared about testing into. Every game I played with against someone who, I felt was like the level of player equal or around me that I wanted to test with. I made sure that we were like playing with lists that were relevant. So if I wasn't playing into someone playing like, I don't know, Decimator X Dory, for instance, unless I actually cared about that matchup, which I didn't. Sorry, so people who like Decimator X Story, but these are kind of things like work smarter, not harder, when it comes to being prepared, and also taking a step back and trying to understand what have we been like this kind of do your homework. I like to say, Brendan, do a bit of research. What lists have been coming out recently? What are people playing? If you're preparing for the Lexi matchup, for instance, what do the Lexi lists look like right now? There's no point in taking a Lexi list from Proto Baltimore. They look so different right now. How many ice cards are they running? What arrows are they running? So you don't get surprised when your opponent just goes like red sedation shot or red withering shot. You're like, what? People don't play this card in Lexi. Well, actually, they have been playing in Lexi more recently, but you haven't been doing your homework and keeping up with it. So, your opponent being more prepared for you when you sit down across from the table is often why you're not going to win events. And I think people can, again, work smarter, not harder, and do the right things. Don't need to spend more time necessarily, just spending the time on the right things to be as prepared as possible for events. Yeah,
I mean, you don't have to be perfect, or you don't even have to be great. You just have to be better than the person across from you. You
outwork the guy beside you, right? That's exactly. That's the old saying. One thing I do want to say, because I know, Brennan, you're a big subscriber to this philosophy, and so am I, is the kind of the mental and physical preparedness in the lead up to an event, especially in the kind of the couple of days before, which is like, making sure that you get a good night's sleep, making sure that as much as possible. I know it's hard, especially when like nerves are there. Maybe it's before, nationals, or even the day before a pro quest, if it's a big pro quest for you, right? Like getting battle hard and whatever it is, like getting in that sleep, getting in a good meal, making sure you've got water and some snacks with you. Like these are the things that I like to make sure are also ticked off my list to make sure I'm not like at an event. I know we've talked about this a lot, but like, where's my next meal coming from, for instance? I want to make sure I've got that ticked off, because that's just being prepared, which I quite like.
Yeah, eliminating all those sort of external things that you might need to think about and just focusing
sideboard
on
notes.
Yep, sideboard notes.
Like sideboard notes.
They come with them printed out. It's like there's no reason for you to be actually devoting any neurons to thinking about those things during the tournament. All right, next point: compounding mistakes and tilt factor. This is actually something that I personally don't suffer from it too much in tournaments, but I know for some people it can be pretty bad, right? This theoretically, this concept, it doesn't actually exist in reality. It's just self-inflicted, right?
Fulfilling.
Yeah. This idea that, once you've lost, you have this mental burden that's going to continue to weigh on you and make you sort of make more mistakes, lose more games, etc., going on tilt. And I mean, I think the best way to manage this is, and I've said it many, many times in this podcast, is to take it game by game, right? Whether you're 7-0 or you're 0-2, etc., it's like you need to take it game by game, because the tournament is not round one. Losing round one doesn't mean you lose a tournament. Even losing round two, the tournament is not over, and you need
shut up, Pablo Pinto.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I mean, there's obviously players that have taken this to great lengths. Won pro tours after 0-2 starts, but taking it game by game and trying to sort of reset after every game, whether win or loss. While the losses can be a bit more destructive for some people, win or loss, reset and take the game for what it is, which is just that individual match that you're now sitting down for.
Yeah. It's so there's I think there's two aspects of this one when it comes to this compounding mistakes and tilt factor. There's match to match, like you just talked about, right? Last game's lost, put it behind you, move on. There's also within a game as well.
There's actually
this
three.
idea of, well, okay, yeah, sure. The second part, okay, I will go is within a game, right? Is like you make a mistake on one turn, and all of a sudden all you can think about is that mistake, and you just make another mistake because you've had loss of attention, or you've just mentally given up the game. Oh, I made this mistake. My opponent's better than me. This mistake was so big, it's so out of character for me that now I'm just mentally not there. Those are the things that are like, honestly, the more you can avoid that, just the better you're going to do. And also, just I think this even extends to kind of like pinning it to like variance and stuff like this. You know, a lot of people go get unlucky, for instance, right? It's like, wow,
just not my day.
opponent drew the last popper in their deck, and you know, like the third side, they saw 3 poppers in the first 3 hands, for instance. Like, how unlucky am I? And then tilt, make a mistake, lose the game, etc.
Yeah.
What's the third one, Brendan?
Oh, so the third one is over months, even years. Actually, the one it's the one I see verbalized the most. Actually, whether it's on Twitter or people come up to me,
I'm
just
so
like,
unlucky.
No, it's not even I'm so unlucky. It's like players are too good. They definitely say that. Don't get me wrong. Like, players are too good now. I can't keep up anymore. Don't have as much time. Like, all this like random shit that doesn't actually really matter to preparing for a new event and preparing for a new match, right? A singular match. But people will take losses or sort of groups of losses and now lump them into like a sort of I don't know, they sort of digest that into a sense of abject failure, right? Like they failed completely because those losses have come, you know, in succession of each other, right? And they go on tilt and thinking that they can no longer compete. You know, people are not better than them. They just are, they're meant to be unlucky, etc. And I think that, you know, I've actually seen a lot of people leave the game, quit the game because of that. They, you know, it's just weird because I think that there's some personalities and some mental games, you know, of people that would lose. They could win a game, lose a game for eternity. But if they win 10 in a row and then they end up losing 5 in a row, they're out. They're done.
Look, and don't get me wrong. I mean, this kind of mental fortitude and it's tough. And also, like, it might not be for everyone in terms of the way that you structure your kind of thinking. And like you just talked about, 10 wins in a row, 5 losses in a row, like those, a loss to you might be just more detrimental disproportionately to a win, right? And you know, that is tough to deal with. I would say that I think if you want to progress in a competitive card game, there's variance. So you're going to have to take losses. Like, even if you play perfect, you're not going to win every event, right? So that's like the first thing you have to like own up to. But then also, no one's making no mistakes. Even the best players in the world are making mistakes, right? So it's kind of idea of trying to shift your mindset to be like, what's happened and mistakes happened, move on, whether that's from the last game, it's from the last turn, or it's from the last tournament, right? Like you say, Brendan, it's and I also think it comes a little bit into what you just talked about, almost comes in a little bit to like you lost before you sat down as well, right? Yeah. Like just kind of that side of the game. It's funny
because card gamers are inherently like quite logical and quantitative in nature. Mm-hmm. But they are like the most lizard brain people sometimes when it comes to looking at stuff holistically. Like when you think about Flesh and Blood, or you think about card games in general, like the actual, one of the core aspects of why you likely play the game or you likely enjoy the game is variance. But people, you know, they get unlucky. They don't want a match here that they thought they should have won, etc. Just, you know, they lose games and they're like, this is terrible. This is not for me, etc. But they don't sort of appreciate that is actually as important to contributing to the experience as the wins, because we've all felt this before. And maybe you've played a video game, you played something, but if you win all the time, games are actually not fun usually, unless you're a psychopath. Like, they're not fun. So if you talk about card game players, they're quantitative, right? They're statistical. They should be looking at the numbers. So what is the exact amount of games that you can lose before you stop having fun, before you stop self-doubting, etc.? It's like, it's completely subjective. Nobody actually has a number. I have to run in an 80-20 clip or I'm out of this game. But you know, if they get them in, it's weird because it's so slippery and like it's not a real thing. But you know, if you look at the game objectively, Flesh and Blood is enjoyable to you, most likely to a large part because of the variance.
I completely agree. Like, it's a hard one because, you know, I can sit here and I think I'm someone, like you're saying yourself, doesn't really get too affected by tilt, right? But I'll tell you what, put me playing a video game and I make the same friggin' cock up multiple times and I can't, like, I was just playing some Spyro the other day, man, just casually playing some Spyro. Me and my fiance were sitting on the couch and I was just like, this little purple dragon, man, I cannot get this up this ledge, and was just like, that annoyed me more than any kind of like mistake or variance in Flesh and Blood, to be honest. But everyone's personal, right? Like, it's all, you have your own kind of things that work or don't work for you. And I think it's just about understanding that, like, and identifying. For me, it's like, okay, like I know that I can only play a video game for so long, especially a tough video game. Like, friggin' give me a Souls game, man, like a Dark Souls game, whatever. Like, I can only play that shit for so long before I know I'm just going to implode. So it's like, and I'm aware of that. I make myself aware of that. And it's like, all right, 2 hours max, and like, I got to go do something else. That's fine, right? That's self-awareness. And I think it's the same in Flesh and Blood, right? It's like, okay, if this event's not going your way, you've started out, and I wouldn't, maybe you've started out 0-2, you win the next one, you lose the next one. It's like, for a lot of people, I would say, like, just play on and, get the reps in, enjoy the day. For a lot of people, it's like, nah, just drop and go and enjoy the rest of your day and get away from Flesh and Blood for a while. Like, it's really going to be subjective based on the person, like you say.
I actually think that if you're a human being, you can't objectively sort of assess these situations. Not perfectly, right? No one has like the perfect mental game where they're appreciating the losses, appreciating the wins. That's why, if you look at just the game, for me, the way that I solve this is I zoom out. I look at the experience, and that's what makes Flesh and Blood fun for me, is I think about it in the entirety of what's happening, right? It's traveling to the event, it's seeing my friends, it's going out to dinner, it's playing the tournament, it's playing the event, it's winning that match, etc. It's like, if you zoom out, it makes it a lot easier to deal with that mental load, because ultimately the reason why you do all of this is to derive some amount of joy or feeling of fulfillment. And that doesn't have to come from the game itself.
For sure. Oh yeah. I think you kind of just nailed it, to be honest.
Yeah. All right, number 5.
I just want to pull back quickly. Like, if I think if you're trying to win more events, then let's just bring it back to the point that I think you have to try and find the ways to avoid this as much as possible. I think that's kind of.
And the 5th and last point is making errors. And Hayden, I'm just going to let you take this one from the top because, you and, I don't know, your association with 3 damage might be able to tell us a little bit about this.
Look, this is going to be the hardest and the highest level one of all, but I think if someone says to me, what is the number one thing that separates Michael Hamilton from, I don't know, Michael Bublé, you're another Michael who plays locally in the, I don't know, whatever. Like, what's the number one thing, separating like the average grinder at a Pro Quest, Battle Hardened calling Pro Tour level and Pro Tour winners? Honestly, it is making errors. Mm-hmm. And this sounds like the easiest thing. It's like, well, just don't make mistakes and you'll win events. Yeah, for sure. Don't make mistakes and you'll win events. But it's about, again, going on this like spectrum of reducing the amount of mistakes you make in an event. And there's so many things that go into this. I think the first of all is actually identifying that you're making mistakes. It's the hardest thing.
Yes, you have to be good enough to recognize mistakes. It's like you actually have to be educated enough on the game to understand where you have made the mistake. Like when you play a game, when you're early into Flesh and Blood, like that is just not something that you can do, right? And that's where you over attribute things to variance and external factors, or you self-blame too much. You're blaming yourself too much when that, there really was no way you could win that game. And this is a concept I literally already said in this pod, but I think that when I first heard this, I thought it was funny, but it's actually so true. It's like card games, a game of Flesh and Blood is actually predetermined. There's the deviation throughout the game. There's just the deviation from the form of the perfect game. The perfect game is a predetermined game that exists already, but you and your opponent just deviate from that. And that is what playing Flesh and Blood is. So the more mistakes you make, the less likely you are to win, the farther you away from sort of playing your deck optimally. And I think that Flesh and Blood ultimately is not a game about making smart plays, making good plays, building good decks. It's just a game about not making mistakes.
Not making errors. Yep. It's a game of not making errors. Literally, like, I think has been one of my biggest kind of level ups and approaches is a game of trying to reduce the number of errors that you make. And honestly, I will fully admit, easier said than done. But I can point to, and I honestly just think this is the difference. Like, you have a good day, you run well, and honestly, what I think running well all the time is like you just play, like you just didn't make mistakes, or you didn't make mistakes in the moments that counted the most, right? And that's where I think it honestly comes down to. And I can point to, I will always make mistakes in events. I can't say I've ever gone through an event and not made a mistake, but there's been events where I've made bigger mistakes than others or more mistakes than others. And honestly, those have led to, for me personally, things like not top 8ing a Pro Tour, have led to things like not potentially, winning a semifinals at my nationals, and a lot of the time, and this is something that my fiance reminds me all the time. She's like, you can say this, right? And you can say you made this mistake, but you can't say that would have determined the outcome of the game a lot of the time. And that is very true. Like, I can point to my top 4 mistake and the 3 damage, like Brendan says. I could have been on 3 more life in my semifinal against Farhad on Kano, right, at this past nationals 2 weekends ago. Would that have determined the outcome of the game? No, not necessarily. The game could have played out very differently, right? Because now the life totals are different. Farhad plays in a different way. I've played in a different way, for instance. But, I think I can point to that mistake and go, that was a fairly significant mistake, which definitely changes the percentage of games I win in that situation, right? Yeah. So It's hard. It's hard.
People look at card games and they look at a game of Flesh and Blood and they'll pick out a variable like that and they'll say, well, if this didn't happen, then I would have won. But the truth of it is that if you change that single variable, the amount of permutations that branch off from that game are actually infinite, right? And you're doing yourself a disservice by thinking that this would have won the game or this would. Maybe it was like you literally missed lethal, but if it's one of these mid-game things, it's kind of like you said, it's important to recognize a mistake, to improve upon it, and to appreciate it. But to look at it as like something that you lost that was taken away from you, it's like that's not real, right? And it's not going to help you at all. So one of the things that helps with not making a mistake is another point that we talked about in this pod, which is just preparedness, is practicing. It's important in Flesh and Blood, pattern recognition. Like that's key. Is like a lot of these players that play at the highest level, they make less mistakes, and a lot of it does come from practice. Some players are more gifted than others, than maintaining focus and making less mistakes, or just critically thinking, etc. But you don't have to be it's not full talent. It's also practice. And the more reps you get on something and the more targeted and focused reps, like, focus testing, etc., the better prepared you're going to be. And ultimately it's not a guarantee, but that should lead to you making less mistakes during the game.
I honestly think all four of the things we've talked before about we're getting to this point are ways that if you improve will reduce the amount of errors you make. Even picking the right deck, for instance, for you in that situation, mental sort of fortitude heading to in a match that you think you might not win, for instance. So I guess just let's talk quickly a few key points on like how to make less errors, I think, kind of from experience. I think one of these is knowing when to play a bit more methodically versus at a normal or good or average pace of play. There's times in a game where I think it is correct and warranted to just slow down a little bit and double check your math. This could be a key turn in a game, for instance, like a combo turn for Kano. This could be instances where you feel like you're about to take a load of damage to pivot. Like this is a situation where more disproportionately than other turns of the game, the impact of you deciding to follow through with this play is going to impact the rest of the game more. Turn to turn doing the same kind of things, blocking with two cards, attacking with a card, for instance. Like that is the small changes, and that are going to be going to be pretty small, right? But the turn where you decide to take all the damage and your life total reduces by 30 to 35%, that now opens up a lot of different avenues for your opponent to progress with the game, right? You just talked about perfect games and making less errors. So I think these are the turns where you need to take a little bit of a step back. I'm not saying slow play or anything like that, but I'm saying just methodically play. And just knowing these points in the game, I think, can really help you make less errors and identify them.
Yeah, one thing, it's kind of a smaller point, but I think it falls under, it's also playing to your outs. I see a lot of players accept defeat before it's actually real, right? So, for instance, I was playing against the Briar as Kano at US Nationals. I was CMH'd quite early in the game as a low life total. And there was a point where my opponent was going to kill me on the next turn. And I didn't play to that out. I knew that I was going to die, and I comboed, and the combo was not effective, right? It didn't kill them. But I now sit at 2 life. My combo didn't work. The game is effectively over. You know what my opponent did on the next turn? They drew all non-attack actions and did nothing. So if I had held that combo and played to the out, the unlikely out, very unlikely out of them drawing full non-attack action hand there, I actually may have been able to win the game. But I didn't play. So there's a lot of ways to win a game of Flesh and Blood that might not be immediately available, especially when it looks like it's overwhelmingly not in your favor. Because your opponent can, although unlikely, potentially draw you into that win. And if you play tight and you keep playing to that out, you will find yourself winning many, many, many more games of Flesh and Blood than you would if you sort of accept defeat early or just take the board state for what it is. Because it is a variance-based card game. There's crazy things that can happen.
Yeah, taking the board state for the way it is in any given moment of time can lead to errors, right? Because you're working 2 turns down the track, you're working on old information, right? So that's another point I wanted to kind of talk about is just always assessing and asking yourself the questions, like key questions. And some of those key questions are, what is the best scenario for my opponent here? What's the best card they could have? What are the ways that I can win from here? So playing to your outside printed, what are the ways I can lose from here? Like what can my opponent have here that would result in not the kind of way this game playing out being the way that I want it to be? What is my opponent likely to do here in this situation in response to what I'm about to do? Just trying to play a little bit ahead as much as possible. And this is going to vary for everyone, right? But I think all these things, if you can kind of improve on them a little bit, they're going to lead to less mistakes because you're going to be ahead of the curve, right? You're going to be ready to intercept potential mistakes that could be made. And then the last thing is like just board information. There's often, I think, a mistake people make is not responding to the information available to them, especially on the other side of the board. So for instance, your opponent pitches like a really important card. Like you're playing as Brute and they pitch Blood Rush Bellows. It's like, why did they pitch that Blood Rush Bellows? Like, is it because they're trying to set up for second cycle? Or is it actually they couldn't have played on this turn because they have too many non-attack actions? Well, that means that they could have Pummel in their hand, for instance, like if they're playing, like there's all these things that can lead to, or the card in the arsenal is
a Blood Rush Bellow, and it's like they likely have it already. They're setting up for it on the following turn. It's important to sort of interpret the information you're presented with correctly, because likely from where you start when you start playing Flesh and Blood to where you may be now or in the future, you will be able to understand the information that's presented to you much better. And that just comes with experience, right? Because what your opponent pitches, what they play, the order they play it in, maybe what they look at, that can happen too, tells you what they could possibly have. Like a funny thing that used to happen, that can happen with Kano, it can happen with other like decks that interact with Sonata Arcanix. When you see your Rainblade opponent randomly the first time the game start looking through the graveyard, you're like, okay, why would they be doing that? Are they fetching stuff from the graveyard? Are they trying to realize, trying to figure out the math on the Sonata Arcanix? How many non-attacks do they have, etc. It's like these are tells. Things like. We don't need to get into it, but there's so many tells that happen in a game of Flesh and
Your
Blood.
Viscera opponent looking through their graveyard, it's like, they've got the recursion card here.
Bones. Yeah,
exactly. Rabbit bones.
Yeah. Your opponent goes, how many cards in deck? Like,
Your opponent, like your Dory opponent, starts looking through their graveyard. Definitely have Singing Steelblade. Anyway, a lot of information you can garner. I think just quickly, like in terms of like things to work on, I think talking through mistakes that happened or errors that potentially could have happened post a game, especially in practice or at Armory level, I think is great to try and learn from. How can you avoid that mistake next time? What strategies, that could have helped in that situation? Yeah, I mean, one of the things for me is like, I had a player at my locals who was in the top 8 of a draft Road to Nationals, and they've got to put their Phoenix Flame in the graveyard as fire when they start the game. And I just said to them, you should put that Phoenix Flame with your hero. Just put it with your hero to make sure you don't make that mistake again, right? Like it's right there when you put your hero down. Anyway, Brendan, I just kind of want to say, to wrap this all up, this kind of, why you aren't winning events, our 5 reasons why you aren't winning more events. Really, a lot of this comes down to there's no single one answer there, and there's no silver bullet, and there's no, hey, we can help you immediately win more events. Unfortunately, we don't have a 10-step process to help you win your ProQuest this coming season. But I do think that all of these things are spectrums and things that you can just you can just continue to try and improve on, continue to think about as focuses when you're trying to get prepared for an event, when you're selecting a deck. So, we talked about bringing the wrong deck to an event. We talked about losing before you sit down from a mental standpoint. We talked about you aren't as prepared as your opponent in terms of the way you're using your time and testing, for instance. You make compounding mistakes and tilt factor. And then, of course, just trying to make less errors is a good way to win more events.
Yep. I mean, I agree. I tend to favor the end that, maybe I'm just not smart enough, I'm not good enough, and that, it's now I think that if you're
game's hard.
Yeah, if you're struggling in Flesh and Blood, and if you're analyzing losses, there is a point at which blaming yourself too much is not the answer, right? Like maybe it was variance, or maybe you simply just aren't good enough, and like you don't need to overburden yourself with like maybe you're thinking you're bad at life or something. But I would say, on the aggregate, I think it's more healthy to look at yourself and blame yourself for mistakes and for losses, for wins as well, than it is to blame variance. I think you will, in the vast majority of scenarios, have a better learning experience from doing that than if you blame something like, oh, my draft pod just drafted wrong. It's like, shut the fuck up. Yeah, definitely try to take accountability for every aspect of your gameplay.
Yeah, and look, lastly, have fun and enjoy it. It's a game, right? Like if you aren't taking joy and enjoyment, I guess, from the process of preparing and playing events, like, I think that's a good reflection of, is this what you want to spend your time doing, to be honest? Like, it's going to be different for everyone.
Yeah, before you quit though, zoom out. Look at the whole thing, because if you think...
For sure.
If you think about it...
I'm not saying quit.
For most people... Yeah, I know, yeah. But for most people... Like, I think it's easy to take loss after loss, or go to an event, lose some money, or just have that experience and like think that like, maybe this game is not for me anymore. If I looked back objectively, or just like, I try to be non-biased about my experience playing Flesh and Blood over the past 3 years, it's been pretty freaking epic. Like, I've made tons of new friends. I've traveled the world. Like, I've had great experiences, etc. So if I go to nationals and I don't make day 2, is that enough to potentially forfeit sort of having those experiences again in the future? It's like, maybe not yet, right? Maybe I'll hit the drawing board again instead of leaving the game.
Yeah. All right, Brendan, take us out.
All right. Well, for those of you losing games, Hayden said there was no 10-step process, but there actually is a 1-step process. You could just listen to this podcast. And if you are listening to it, check it out on YouTube at youtube.com/ArsenalPass. And yeah, I mean, there's no chance you're going to win games if you aren't subscribed. And if you're subscribed, you might as well like. You've been listening to Arsenal Pass for 126 episodes. I know you're out there, one of you that's not subscribed yet. Like, what are you doing? Jeez. Check us out on pod platforms. You can review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, one of the most impactful and beneficial things you can do to help us out. Check out the Arsenal Pass Patreon. We got the Jermai deck up there. We got the Kano deck up there probably soon after this releases, kind of around that time. Peter, great Kano player, gave us some great resources to put up as additional if you want to check it out with the math and the cyborg guide, etc. And supporting us on Patreon, just it helps us do what we do and continue to run Arsenal Pass. So we appreciate all of you that are current Patreons and big thank you to those who are about to be our future patrons. With that concludes the episode. The top things you can do, or what you can do to stop losing games of flesh and blood.
How to win more events. Yes, I was reframing. But thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next week. See you later.